Hello, good morning and welcome as the world scrambles to react to the biggest single shift in US economic and foreign policy in decades. At a stroke in the Rose Garden last night, Donald Trump became the most protectionist president since Herbert Hoover in the 1930s. Global trade will now change, perhaps irrevocably, and leaders everywhere are working out how to pick up the pieces this morning and understand what it means politically as well as economically. Global markets already falling this morning. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And my name is Anne McElvoy of Politico. Today on Politics at Sam and Anne's, we're going to digest what that Liberation Day means for Britain, for Keir Starmer, and for relations not just with the US, but with our biggest trading partners, the EU. The headline for us here from April the 5th, Saturday, President Trump will impose tariffs of 10% on all goods, including British exports to the US, a £60 billion market. Separately, the 25% import taxes on cars entering the US came 90 minutes before we recorded this podcast. That now already seems like a long time ago at the pace of events. As of now, it remains unclear whether British negotiators will be able to reduce or even eliminate any of this, but overnight, Downing Street made very clear they are going to try.
Number 10 rolling out that line once more that it's a moment for calm heads. So far, a strategy that, means the UK has fared less badly than other US allies. On that big board that Donald Trump held up in the Rose Garden last night, Britain, one of the 20 countries facing the smallest import tariffs of anywhere around the world. But interestingly, the tone of number 10 overnight, they're going further than that. They're saying that even though the world is standing on the precipice of a trade war, those at the top of the government, British government, feel that there's a sense of vindication. Yes, and vindication is the word that they're using just at the moment because we're in that smallest band, and happily pointing out the difference between the 10% that's applied to the UK and the 20% plus that others will face to US exports means the difference of people hanging on to thousands of jobs. Is that the right tone? Well, we'll find out in the coming days.
So you're getting Vindication Day vibes there from number 10, Sam.
Yeah, as the stock markets turn red, I think it's an interesting poise to strike.
Let's dive into that in a moment. This morning in Downing Street, Keir Starmer will be entertaining business leaders on a reassurance mission, no doubt there, and giving his first public reaction to the US moves. On this podcast, we're going to give you everything to arm you for an extraordinary day ahead. And the political news hasn't paused either just because Donald Trump grabbed the global microphone.
Things haven't stopped. They really haven't. And there's big stuff going on that we can't really ignore. I'm just going to trot through two or three things before we get back to our discussion about global tariffs. First of all, in the next day or so, I think from the Home Office, we're going to get the inquiry into last summer's Southport murders. I think it's going to be a big moment. It won't cover the riots, I understand, but will go into all the public failures that led to the murder of 3 girls. So that's a big moment. Secondly, so watch out for this. We're going to get a planning decision on Luton Airport expansion. Heidi Alexander behind that decision, so we'll find out. I think it'll go ahead. And this is something that might not happen today, but will be absolutely massive in the coming days. And it is adjacent to the news about trade. And that is that I think British steel is pretty much on the brink right now. There's been days of negotiation, the government not offering enough to keep that going in the eyes of the company. But does that mean that we're about to see a very, very large chunk of Britain's domestic steel industry disappear, pretty much instantly, and that has implications for trade at this moment, where one of the things that the steel industry is facing is tariffs for goods going to the US. So all sorts of high wire negotiations around that fits back into the picture of the main story today.
But back to the major news overnight, Donald Trump has upended the decades-old consensus that lowering trade barriers helps foster ties among nations, prevents conflicts and makes everyone more prosperous. Standing in the Rose Garden last night in front of workers from the Rust Belt who helped put him there, he embraced tariffs as a tool to assert US power, reviving manufacturing at home and exacting political concessions from other world leaders. He was pretty clear in that punitive tone. Will it work, or will it, as economists have been warning this morning, mean higher US prices and slower growth, or perhaps even a recession?
And it's that impact of global recession that is one of the big reasons why, whatever the tone of vindication that you're getting from Downing Street overnight, they will not be sort of bringing out the bunting in the Treasury, I suspect. Downing Street this morning are going to make a lot of that fact that Britain has been hit by less than other countries, including long-term allies. It's really interesting, Anne, looking at that board that Donald Trump held up. The European Union, according to that, is facing tariffs of 20%. Japan, massive long-term US ally, 24%. China, well, they've got 34% on top of the previous 20%. So the tariffs that Chinese goods now face above 50%, which is basically going to kill that market if they're left in place for some time. And that will just have a big geopolitical shift that is going to change alliances as well as trade flows. Vietnam, 46%. Israel, a country that Donald Trump couldn't have been closer to since he became president, has higher tariffs than we do in the UK on 17%. And although that Taiwan does have higher tariffs as well, quite high tariffs, just the mere fact that it appeared on that board as a separate country actually is something that has been quite widely noted and something of a relief. Russia, however, was not on the board at all, prompting some questions about what's going on there. But let's start with what the UK is going to do, because it does mean a global trade war does result in investment down, trade down, people losing their jobs, markets flooded, and all of that is going to mean less tax and revenue for Rachel Reeves, and that's going to probably impact the headroom, the amount of money she's left, the wiggle room before she breaks her self-imposed fiscal rules. And so all of this is very difficult. You will hear from the Prime Minister at that business meeting, but also there'll be a common statement by Johnny Reynolds, we expect, although that hasn't been fully confirmed yet. But other than make those remarks, there's not going to be a response, a sort of substantive response from the UK. We're getting all of this kind of talk from other countries, but the UK isn't going to do anything particularly meaningful beyond repeat the kind of lines that we've already told you about today. So there's nobody jumping on calls with other leaders. I'm told nobody is booking plane tickets, so there's not going to be an emergency Johnny Reynolds, the business secretary, visit back to the US. He was there last week, but he's not about to jump on a plane. It is all for now about taking stock.
And as important as the numbers are here, Sam, the vibe also matters, doesn't it? And the political reverberations. So the goal of Keir Starmer and of ministers over the next coming days looks to me like a couple of things. One is to reassure business, hence that, for instance, probably the last thing that Keir Starmer fancies this morning is an early breakfast in number 10, but it is worth it to get those business leaders through the door, explain how the government is going to respond and try to put across why that smoothing over, as it's being called in government, is the better way to go about this, and push on with those efforts to secure a broader deal with the US and maybe, just maybe, a carve out from these tariffs down the line. So the minimum baseline rate that the UK got, 10%, well, that sparked some sighs of relief throughout the government. I'm told last night, as you said earlier, nobody was going to cheer or put out the bunting. But I think there was a very long, extended sigh of relief that it could have been a lot worse. That is the line that we will hear again and again. It's pretty hard, isn't it, for the opposition or internal Labour critics to say that Keir Starmer has been mishandling this by schmoozing too much with Donald Trump, is a line that was building up as a critical assault, given that we got away, as we did. But no doubt about it, this still has major impacts. So that seems to me also a line that Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves, etc., Johnny Reynolds have to walk, is not to say, hey, this is all going to be okay now, because the impacts are going to be real and you need to prepare people for that.
One of the things I think this morning that's working in Keir Starmer's favour is sort of broader politics, right? So the main manufacturing group, so Make UK, and they represent a lot of the people who will be worst hit by all of this. They've already been out and about, and far from attacking the UK government, they have decided deliberately to heap praise both on Keir Starmer and on Johnny Reynolds. They say that having the UK in the 10% band is a definite reflection of the efforts that he's been putting on to sort of smooth relations with the US, and also saying that Johnny Reynolds has worked tirelessly to to craft some kind of deal with the US that might come to fruition in the coming days. So you don't have business groups attacking the UK. The second thing is that although there is criticism from the Conservatives about some of the ways in which the government has handled these trade talks to this point, they are not proposing a fundamentally different approach. So it might not sound like it tonally, but the Tories are pretty aligned with the Labour Party, with the government. It is the Liberal Democrats that are proposing a significantly different shift. Right. So what the Labour Party and the Tory Party aren't saying is we need to have a big escalation. We need to find global partners with which we can all work together in order to build an economic coalition of the willing and attack the US with that, basically due to them much more aggressively what they're doing to us. The economic coalition of the willing is the suggestion of the Liberal Democrat leader, Ed Davey. But because all the other parties aren't making that suggestion at Keir Starmer, that just gives them a little bit more breathing space. But, one of the things that I've sort of come to realise, Anne, is that they might tell us that there has been a sigh of relief inside Downing Street. But just because they tell us that is the case doesn't always mean that there is. Often as political journalists, we get briefed emotions of the Prime Minister, emotions of the people at the top of politics. And I always struggle to quite believe the briefings that we get because we can't verify it. And just because they say something doesn't necessarily mean it's true. It's part of the narrative that they are trying to give to us. Because the bottom line is that a week ago, Downing Street didn't anticipate or didn't want us to be where we were tonight. They were very much hoping that a week ago today, we were going to be signing some kind of bespoke deal that would mean that none of this was happening. Now, in the end, they appear to have misread Donald Trump, and he has imposed the 10% baseline tax from Saturday night on everybody. So is it all really relief? Or is number 10 just scrambling to keep up but trying to disguise that fact? So always, I think it's important to reflect the fact that to pinch yourself when they tell you the emotions of political leaders. That's part of the story they want you to report, rather than necessarily a full reflection of the mood at the top of government.
That is a really fair point. I love the idea of briefing emotions. So maybe Downing Street should just communicate in emojis. What they think Keir's face should look like in our heads.
Let me give you an example. For years, we were told that David Cameron was rolling up his sleeves and getting on with the job, right? I never once actually thought that he unbuttoned that sleeve and did that. These are techniques and tricks to convey a story and a narrative, but I don't think there's any expectation, certainly in some Downing Streets, that any of this is true.
Okay, it's a metaphor, Sam Coates. Oh my goodness, it's too early for this. No, I take your point. Where I do take your point is that they didn't want to be here, and then when the facts change, not as Keynes said, you change your mind, but you change your emotional register. So that is why we're getting it could all be worse. That is a really good angle on this. But in one sense, it's sort of true that we are doing less badly out of this, certainly, than our EU neighbours. Now, that is an area where I think the Prime Minister, there's a sotto voce thing here, that appeals a bit to the Brexiteers to say, well, it'd be a lot worse if you were still in the EU, mate, And then there's the other side of that, which it just looks like 10%, yes, but that gives the UK perhaps a bit more wriggle room for negotiation. And I think you can see already the consequences of that in the difference of response between the UK, the smoothing over, pragmatic, cool heads, etc., and what we're hearing, that much hotter and more aggrieved tone from the EU, led by Ursula von der Leyen there, who basically said it was dangerous and tearing up the global trade order, but also from what I would call the family and friends network of relationships of Donald Trump with leaders who are closer to his worldview. We had Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, who's had a pretty close relationship with Trump, saying this is wrong and not in the interests of either party. The only outright ally I would suggest that he has is Hungary, blaming the EU for mishandling trade and tariffs, not Trump. So I think you can see a pretty close alignment there. I just want to throw in one other, as your Kremlin correspondent on this podcast, just one other little noted Russia's chief negotiator on investment, Kirill Dmitriev, is headed to Washington this week for talks. That looks like something is moving there towards that elusive peace deal, but it may also explain something that you pointed out, that Russia is nowhere to be seen on that list, and I think probably heading for very favourable treatment. So there's politics as well as economics in this brew, isn't there?
There was quite a lot there on the reaction of other countries, but I just want to bring it back to the United Kingdom, because there is a angle to what's going on that we have not really sufficiently dived into, but is very, very urgent and important. And that's what's going on in Northern Ireland. Now, when it comes to tariffs, what is often forgotten in Westminster, but is definitely not forgotten in Belfast, is that as a result of our Brexit deal, Northern Ireland remains not only part of the UK's customs territory, but also, in order to maintain that invisible border, has to apply EU customs and other goods-related laws in order to, on goods coming into the island of Ireland, into Northern Ireland. In other words, what goes on in Northern Ireland in the next few days could be completely different to the response from the rest of Great Britain. Let me explain. It sounds very much as if the UK is not going to, Westminster is not going to impose retaliatory tariffs, at least so long as negotiations are going on. However, the EU is very likely to. But if the EU imposes tariffs, higher tariffs on US goods coming into its territory, that will also apply to Northern Ireland. So a part of our territory of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, will be taking part in those retaliatory tariffs as the rest of Great Britain does not. That is extraordinarily politically difficult for Keir Starmer, for the Union, for politics in general. It's unclear what the reaction of the US will be to that. You know, it really reminds us that we have this extreme anomaly of a post-Brexit settlement when it comes to Northern Ireland because of the unique political situation there. And we forget that at its peril. I don't know how it's going to play out, but it's massive. And there are completely different rules applying to Northern Ireland. And you heard at Prime Minister's Questions yesterday, Gavin Robinson, the DUP leader, sort of raising this one up the flagpole. I think it is something that had been collectively forgotten, but needs to be remembered pretty quickly. And we know that meetings in government are underway on this.
Yeah, I said earlier, from the perspective of pro-Leave or Brexiteer MPs, that this was a talking point moment where you could actually say we got into a different and in some senses a more alleviated, if not better, position than the EU. But you remind us there, Sam, that everything that is to do with that island, Northern Ireland, UK trade borders relationship, it is always impacted by everything else that happens, and it still doesn't feel, for all the attempts to settle it, that it got settled, and that's a really good point to remember. I wonder what the policy response will ultimately be there from the government on that.
Okay, so things we'll be looking at today. We'll be looking at the stock markets. The Asian market's already turning red. I think we basically know the response to the UK government, although we're in a holding pattern. Of course, we're very, very close to the end of the parliamentary term. It's recessed from Tuesday of next week. So a lot of this will play out without MPs being in Westminster beyond the next few days. I think the critical thing will be looking at some of those carve-outs. By the way, it sounds as if pharmaceutical goods might be exempted from some of these tariffs. There are all sorts of little anomalies that you won't see until you get to look at the US documents that Donald Trump signed in the Oval Office last night. So there's quite a lot more investigating of this process. But more than anything else, we've got to work out what the impact is, what goods are going to end up flooding the UK market, how different countries end up trying to attract the attention of President Trump to get a deal quickly to avoid their tariffs, and watch how Keir Starmer does it. Far from relaxed, I think it's going to be a tense few days, because Keir Starmer will not want to leave it too long before he's able to claim some kind of further resolution.
And if you're a glass half empty kind of person, you might also think, well, you know, that 10% flat rate being touted, as you pointed out, insistently as relief on the UK side. Well, a number of other countries also escaped relatively lightly in that way, and they didn't have to offer a handwritten invitation to a state visit with the King. So there you go. Is it going to work out?
We will find out. We'll be able to reflect that on Monday when we're back for the new week of Politics at Sam and Anne's. So for all of our listeners, thank you very much indeed. Have a lovely weekend.
Tariff-free weekend to you.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.